Good day, everyone, and welcome to the latest of my appreciations of my favourite science fiction short stories. Perhaps short story is a bit of a misnomer for today's story, and novella would be more appropriate as it's a little bit longer than just a short story. Now, I've always been fascinated by time travel stories. The more mind bending the paradox, the better. And as the saying goes, Tom waits for no one. Time waits for no one. And in reality, living time travel through these stories is perhaps the only way we will ever achieve it. Current understanding of physics is not encouraging to the idea of time travel to the past, while not entirely ruling it out. And while relativistic time travel to the future is possible, it would take prodigious amounts of energy, and it's a one-way trip. And Walter White says time travel is garbage, so there you have it. But stories we have, and many famous writers of old such as Hans Christian Andersen, Lewis Carroll, Edgar Allan Poe, and Mark Twain wrote time travel stories. Many early time travel works involved an individual unwittingly thrown back or forward in time and their struggle to adapt in that unfamiliar era. First in his 1988 The Chronic Argonauts, and then 7 years later in his celebrated novel The Time Machine, futurist H.G. Wells took the different approach of an individual in possession of a machine that could be controlled to move them through back and forwards in time. This still was the single individual in time trope, though, with no real attempt to examine paradoxes created. In fact, the protagonist in The Time Machine never travels back into his own past before his origin point, merely returns to the departure point in time from the far future. This isn't meant to throw shade on H.G. Wells, by the way, who is a magnificent writer, a writer whose stories are so good they are still read and adapted to this day. The Time Machine is a seminal work, not only because of the time travel aspect, but also the speculation on human and societal development, or indeed lack of development, or regression in the far future. However, let's move forwards to discuss today's subject, By His Bootstraps, published as written by Anson MacDonald in the October 1941 edition of Astounding Science Fiction. MacDonald was actually the pen name of Robert A Heinlein, and this may have been a cunning attempt to get paid twice, as he had a story under his own name in the same edition. By His Bootstraps may be the first significantly known work to really use the paradoxes inherent in time travel as a significant part of the story. And in fact, without those paradoxes, there would be no story to write. So I don't think it's too excessive to say that this novella became a template for future temporal paradox tales. As per the title, this story presents an example of a bootstrap paradox. In this scenario, an infinite loop is created by a person travelling back in time, where it's impossible to determine the origin of anyone or any item caught up in that loop. The related predestination paradox is also involved. Both are examples of closed loops in time. Through the story, we follow a version of Bob. Let's call him Bob Prime. We start with Bob Prime locked in his room trying to meet a deadline to complete his thesis. A time portal opens and a future version of himself, Bob 2, comes through it to persuade Bob Prime to step through the portal to the future. Then a third version from both their futures, Bob 3, appears to try and stop Bob Prime from entering the portal. Bob Prime, however, does enter the portal and ends up far in the future where he meets an older man named Dictor, operator of the time portal, who promises Bob Prime that he can rule the primitive but docile people in the future if he just returns to the past to persuade himself to step into the portal. We then follow Bob Prime back in time where he becomes Bob 2, and then through more jumps to become Bob 3. And interestingly, at each stage, Bob Prime tries to not follow the path of the previous Bobs, but finds himself unable to change his actions. Bob Prime, after fulfilling the predestined actions of Bob 3, is now alone, and after picking up a few items suggested by Dictor, decides to usurp Dictor by using his time portal and travelling back 10 years before he first meets him. He takes with him Dictor's notebook, which details the language of the primitive humans in the future and other useful information, and he hopes to establish himself in the future before Dictor appears and thwart his plans. So I shall not reveal the ending, although you can see where it's going. The most interesting paradox is actually the all-important notebook, which Bob Prime steals and ends up copying to a new notebook when the old one wears out, which then ends up in the hands of Dictor. Who created this notebook that circles around a 10-year time loop? And once the ending is revealed, who really began the time loops of Bob? Apparently he just pulled himself up by his own bootstraps. Heinlein loved playing with causality and later went on to further explore these paradoxes in All You Zombies, where a person appears to become their own parents. This was filmed in the 2014 movie Predestination, which I kind of like. I'm a big fan of Ethan Hawke, who's the star of that movie. And the 1973 novel by David Gerald, The Man Who Folded Himself, takes these scenarios to its extreme and is also a great read. So that's all the time we've got time for today. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, a comment, and subscribe. Till next time, keep on looking to the future.